How do we form our knowledge about the Russian-Ukrainian war? This war also concerns the politics of knowledge production. Today we are going to talk about the epistemically unjust myth of Russian imperial innocence and why episteme of pacifism is deadly dangerous. You're listening to the podcast Explain Ukraine. My name is Volodymyr Yermolenko. I am a Ukrainian philosopher, journalist, and chief editor of UkraineWorld. In this episode, my colleague Daria Synhaievska, analyst and journalist at UkraineWorld, is joined by Olga Burlyuk, assistant professor at the Department of Political Science at the University of Amsterdam, and the co-author of the article that achieved the prestigious award Best Article Prize of the American Association for Ukrainian Studies. UkraineWorld is brought to you by Internews Ukraine, one of the largest Ukrainian media NGOs. Explain Ukraine is a podcast by UkraineWorld. Let me remind you that you can support our work at patreon.com/UkraineWorld. We provide exclusive content for our patrons. You can also support our volunteer trips to the front lines at PayPal, ukraine.resisting@gmail.com. You can find these links in the description of this episode.
Dear Olga, welcome and thank you for joining.
Thank you for inviting me, Daria. It's a huge honor, and it's also extremely interesting for me to have this conversation with you and hopefully feedback from the listeners one day. Thanks for having me.
For sure. And basically, the topic of this episode is extremely urgent because the full-scale Russia's invasion clearly influenced a lot. And one thing is the perception, or to some extent, deconstruction of the notion of Eastern Europe. For example, what started in 2022 is perceived not as periphery situation, but as a frontier one. And it also emphasized how Russia routinizes the practice of imperial colonization and how it becomes mundane. So what comes to mind is Hannah Arendt's thesis on banality of evil, right? Because this ideological encapsulation goes along with everyday practices with silent exception of what is going on. So in our case, it's salient, I guess, versus silent. And I know for sure that you have some thoughts on this matter. So maybe you can dwell on how the politics of knowledge production functions in Russia's war against Ukraine.
Thanks for the lead in. I think in a way the war understood as Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine in 2022, which was the time that the war actually started for many people in the West, because somehow the events of 2014 went by, were archived as domestic, small-scale, insignificant, somehow historically justified, etc., etc. So I think in the mental maps and mental perceptions of many people around the world, the war really only just started in 2022, and I think in a way it served as a trigger for a huge conversation in the field. And the field, actually, I should be saying plural fields, fields of international relations, but also fields of peace and conflict studies, fields of area studies, whether that's called, Russia and Eurasia studies, or Central and Eastern Europe studies, or post-Soviet studies, or post-communist studies. If you look at the names of departments and names of journals, university departments and academic journals, you will be seeing, one of these labels traditionally used. I think in a way the war served as a major trigger for having this conversation, actually, because many of the local voices have been arguing for a need to look at Russia critically, for a need to look at the region with the use of colonial and imperial frames as a minimum. And there hasn't been much receptiveness to that in the general academic conversation. Politics of knowledge production, it basically comes down to that. When you look at all the different commentary that's been very quickly, almost instantaneously generated by experts in quotation marks. I'm waving with my fingers. I'm visualizing quotation marks now. Experts, academic experts, policy experts, political experts, civil society experts all around the world who've been, generating commentary on what is going on, what exactly is going on, and what the West should be doing. What the response should be. One way to go about it is to try to kind of combat and rebut and counter each and every bullshit proposal. Can we use swearing words in this podcast, or do we need to stay very polite? I think there's no other way to capture it. You can spend all your time and another half hour on trying to rebut each and every nonsensical, illogical, factually incorrect proposal on what should be happening. Or you can look to the core and bring it all under one frame of the politics of knowledge production. And that's what I ended up doing over the past 2 years, throughout 2022 and 2023. Politics of knowledge production on the war, Russia's war against Ukraine, but also not only looking at it in the context of the war itself, but also looking at it in the context of knowledge production in IR, peace and conflict studies, area studies, Ukraine studies, Russia studies, Eastern European, Eurasian studies. I've been thinking and writing, but also coordinating efforts of other scholars on this, and it came out in two published works, and of course many more talks and conferences and things like that. One you mentioned already. It's an article that was published in the journal Contemporary Security Policy, and the full title of the article is quite lengthy and maybe confusing. I will say it now. Encountering Epistemic Imperialism, a critique of West's planning and coloniality in dominant debates on Russia's invasion of Ukraine. So this was one of the outcomes. And another was a special issue published in the Journal of International Relations and Development, titled The Responsibility to Remain Silent, on the politics of knowledge production, expertise and self-reflection in Russia's war against Ukraine. And both of these made an attempt at looking at the academic debate, but also expert debates, to the extent that academia, spills over into policy conversations, and basically, diagnose what exactly is wrong with it. All right. And on the one hand, we were trying to give a timely response, to kind of be quick in response to the urgency of the matter. But at the same time, we've been trying to work in ethical way, unlike so many other colleagues in academia, in a kind of slow science, ethical way, with regard to the contributors, allowing time for peer review, and things like that. And if I were to summarize the message of these two publications in layman words, it would be: you are wrong, and it's killing people, right? And if you read the two publications, you will see the many ways in which we say academic conversation and academic takes on the war have been completely off. And as you can imagine, it's not an easy message to send. It was easy for us to send it in the way we are ready to send it, but it was not easy, of course, to articulate it, to put it out, and to voice it in each and every event, because that you will be facing huge pushback. Because most are not prepared to hear it, especially not from women, especially not from Eastern European women, especially not from non-senior scholars, because each of these works has been a collaborative effort, and I can tell about that in a minute. I was working on this not alone. I was working on it with colleagues from Czech Republic, from Kazakhstan, from Kosovo, and then bringing on board also scholars from all across the region. Right, so it was a huge task, and I'm happy to see that it got through, it got out. It definitely caused resonance, in the sense that people either absolutely love it and say, this is it, this is the one paper I'll be teaching from now on, this is the one paper I'll be citing in my every next publication, And at the same time, there's huge pushback saying, oh, this is really cute. You're doing critical studies. Oh, I find it really cute. I see it's very emotional for you. Yeah, I really respect the effort, but yeah, I don't buy any of it. Right. And then you can imagine this usually would be commentaries, from white Western men. And there's a huge kind of gender aspect there as well. And we can come back to that if you wish. So yeah, I don't know if this was a very lengthy introduction from me.
But the research basically got its way successfully, I guess, not only by acknowledging it as vital through the sword, but also through messaging the essence of this war. And I guess this epistemic imperialism shares the notion of the epistemology of coloniality by calling attention to the boundaries between knowledge, the known, and the knowing subject. And the Russian military assault against Ukraine is accompanied by this epistemic violence against Ukraine because it tries to deny Ukraine's agency, and the atrocities perpetrated by the Russians challenges this ethical and intellectual vision. So maybe you can share, how do we encounter this epistemic imperialism?
First, I want to jump in on what you just said, that actual, material on the ground war effort is accompanied by, the epistemic erasure that Russia has been doing with regard to Ukraine, but also with regard to other states, societies, and peoples in the region being, Central Eastern Europe, South Caucasus, Central Asia, but also let's not forget all the indigenous peoples within the Russian Federation, right? The Federation bit is usually forgotten. Russia did a great job creating an image, of a Slavic urban core and completely silencing its own peoples, its own diversity. And of course, I would say that it's not even accompanied with that. It's actually preceded by that. Preceded as the epistemic erasure came first, and then when that wasn't working out, when that wasn't bringing the results that were intended, then the material war followed because it became necessary, right? And I would say that it's not only that Russia is doing it, but it's doing it at a yeah. I'm looking for words, if I should say it, silent approval, active approval, or even, enthusiastic approval by many scholars in the West, right? And once I was, digging into this subject, and we were looking at, maybe, there was a publication published in 22 or 23, a little study by a group of Ukrainian analysts who looked at the regional studies throughout the United States and who they actually cover, which countries, which subjects, and how, it's 90% Russia and maybe 5% Ukraine, and then, 0.5% all the other countries. I'm gravely generalizing and summarizing, right? But they were basically looking at the state of regional studies, area studies, and saying, listen, you're not looking at the region, you're just looking at Russia, right? When I was digging into this, I was surprised to discover a source from 1950s. So there was an article in 1950s that did this kind of analysis and reached the exact same conclusion in 1950s. And then you sit down and think like, whoa, it's been 75 years and literally nothing changed. And in the meantime, the Soviet Union collapsed and we've had 30 plus years, almost 35 now, years of independence for all of the countries and well, states, countries, societies, nations, right? A different label might fit a different country better, and that nothing changed. And there, you come to questions of complicity, right? To what extent was this ignorance, and to what extent was this just lack of interest, and to what extent was this agreement that indeed Russia is the only one that matters and everybody else can be disregarded? In which case, the epistemic erasure was not only propelled by Russia itself, which is, of course, at the forefront of it, and there is no denying it. But this whole agenda was received well, basically, and played out well. Now, also going back to your question, you've used the term epistemic imperialism, and I don't know if we need to explain it maybe to the to the audience a little bit, because it's like, we're speaking in code, and I imagine we have a broad audience, and probably not everybody read the article or will want to read the article or will have the time to read it. Although let me mention that both the forum and the article are published open access, so you can just, Google them and read them for free. You don't need to, there's no paywalls involved, right? In our work, we operate with concepts of epistemic imperialism and inter-imperiality, and also speak of coloniality of knowledge. And let me elaborate what we mean. Epistemic imperialism, the way we use it, is a concept put forward by Daria Synhaievska, and it refers to the hubris of believing that what one knows or studies from a privileged perspective, as within the Anglophone, Northwest European, North American, North Atlantic Academy, can be exported wholesale to context about which one knows little or nothing, right? And that's what we see. There are all these grand theories developed in the, grand theories on how international relations work, grand theories on what brings peace, grand theories on how conflicts are resolved, which are, well, theoretically developed, right? Pardon my tautology, right? Which are theoretically formulated in the West by people who have usually never experienced war, in countries that have usually, haven't experienced this kind of war, or at least not in their generation, and who often have very little knowledge about countries and wars they are talking about, right? And they formulate all these grand theories that are supposed to work. And then these theories are automatically, unconditionally, uncritically, incontextually applied to basically to solve, to problem solve other people's wars. And whatever doesn't fit, whatever empirical reality, whatever of the real life that doesn't fit the theory is dismissed or disregarded, right? And that's what we have. And that's why we have all these, arguments of a kind that, I don't know, NATO provoked Russia and Russia is cornered and is just defending itself, or arguments like, Ukraine should just cede parts of its territory and peace will follow, that's the price of peace, or, that it's better to live under occupation than to spill blood in the battlefield, completely ignoring the realities of occupation, basically, and the blood that's been spilled in that context, right? So that's the idea, and we are having this conversation, right, for UkraineWorld podcast. So our primary interest is Ukraine, and our primary focus is Russia's war against Ukraine. But of course, this notion of epistemic imperialism and this practice of epistemic imperialism goes way beyond. And basically, I would say there's global reach, and more or less anything happening on the globe, when it's being explained from the West, is explained usually within the frame of epistemic imperialism of one kind or another. The idea of the second concept, the second idea that we use to organize our writing and our thinking on the subject, is the idea of inter-imperiality. It comes from Laura Doyle. And the idea is that there are multiply vectored relations among empires and among those who endure and maneuver among empires. So the logic here would be that there are, the Western empires and there is the Russian Empire, and these have complicated relations amongst themselves and their own hierarchies, right? Between, the Western empires, the Russian Empire, who is the true empire, who is the superior empire, who is the secondary empire, who is, how Russia is supposedly, fighting to regain its great power and great empire status, etc. But that there are also, so there's inter-empire realities, right? Inter-imperiality as relations between the empires, but also inter-imperiality as those who are stuck between the empires, those who suffer between the empires, those who, endure these imperial practices and who are, the colonies of this. And in this context, then, Ukraine would be basically fighting against both, Russian imperialism and Western imperialism towards Ukraine, but also Western imperialism towards Russia. And, these have to be called out and explained and refuted basically in an effort to fully emancipate Ukraine.
Yeah, I couldn't agree with you more because with the start of the full scale invasion, I guess the world also learned to unlearn about Russia, its legacy, its artificially made history, and the world learns about Ukraine. And that you said this stated this comparison between, for example, Russia study centers compared to Ukraine study centers in quality and quantity, and during the full scale war, the quantity and quality of the latter has risen drastically. So it's also an attempt to contextualize the knowledge, as you said. But what about undoing, this epistemic injustice towards Ukraine? Can you please uncover this epistemically unjust myth of Russian imperial innocence?
Yeah, the work of undoing. That's of course, I don't know what's more difficult, the doing or the undoing. And of course, in this case, the undoing is a huge challenge, but it's also very necessary, vitally necessary, not only for Ukraine but for everybody else in the region. And let me emphasize here as well that, as I already briefly mentioned, both of these works, the special forum on the responsibility to remain silent and the article on, encountering epistemic imperialism, both of these were collaborations. I worked together with Vjosa Musliu, who is a scholar of Western Balkans from Kosovo. I worked with Teresa Hendel, who is a political philosopher, actually, and bioethicist. So not even an IR political science scholar from Czech Republic, based in Germany. I worked with Mila O'Sullivan, who is a scholar of feminist security studies, working on Central East European agenda in the feminist security studies based in Prague, and Isa Daria, who's a sociologist and a scholar of post-colonial studies looking at Central Asia, specifically Kazakhstan, currently based in the US, right? So in our own lived experiences and, intergenerational trauma and personal trauma, all of us have experienced, the legacy, the Russian imperialism, either firsthand or as a legacy. All of us are familiar with the nuances in the, of what's going on in the region, and all of us can see similarities and patterns between what Russia is doing in all the different countries, right? So it was also part of our, agenda to make this argument bigger and stronger, and in a way go beyond Ukraine to say, listen, this is just one of the many. And just solving this one, just peace for Ukraine, will not solve Russian imperialism at all, right? It has to be solved through the defeat of Russia and through the undoing of imperialism. And in order to undo imperialism, like you used the word undo, I think it's really well placed there. It needs to be, as a minimum, recognized for what it is, right? And then, as a next step, undone. Right? And what do we mean by Russian imperial innocence, right? On the one hand, it's self-explanatory, but on the other hand, it's maybe confusing to the listeners as well. Imperial innocence, right? It would imply that either Russia is not really an empire, or it's not, or it's an innocent one, and not an evil empire, as what we know from the Western empires. So yeah, the mainstream understanding, the mainstream science or take on this would basically follow the logic of we, the Western states, the former Western empires. We are the true empires. We had the overseas colonies, which are the true colonies. Russia, therefore, was not really an empire because its territories were not overseas, but attached by land. And the issue of race is either a non-issue, because look at you, you're all Slavic. There is no racial aspect to this, so therefore it's not colonization, and therefore it's not really an empire. Or it's an ambiguous issue because, of course, then the societies of Central Asia, of Northwest Asia, all the indigenous people of Russia will say, hey, wait a minute, there's a huge racial aspect here. But it's either not known or kind of downplayed, right? So Russia was never really an empire, and these were never really colonies in the way we know it from the Western states. We were the true colonizers. And anyway, it ended long ago, right? Russian Empire fell apart when the Soviet Union was formed, and the Soviet Union was a friendly federation of brotherly peoples, right? So kind of disregarding or denying the fact that these were also, in a way, in a way, in many ways, a continuity of the Russian Empire with the same, colonial logics. And then the argument would continue. Okay, if you insist, Russia is an empire, was an empire, is an empire, but it's a second-tier one. It's not really not fully an empire as we are, and anyway, it's always secondary to what we are doing. So it's cornered by us. It's reacting to what we do, etc., etc. Right, again, these arguments that Russia is provoked by NATO. Paradoxically, this argument denies agency to Russia and says, that NATO and Russia is reacting. So again, the West was first, and Russia is just, being cornered and reacting to what's been done to it. Right? Essentially, kind of collectively, if you take cumulatively all of this, it's a huge analytical, intellectual effort to justify and normalize Russia's aggressive behavior. Either to downplay it and say this is not really what's happening, or to justify and say, like, well, yeah, this is a natural course of events. It's basically internal affairs. It's an internal affairs of an authoritarian regime. And there is a great article in the special forum that I co-edited with Vjosa Musliu, written by Ryhor Nizhnikov and Andrei Makarychev, who are making a point, kind of looking over the debate in IR and saying it not only failed to see Russia for what it is, it actually, spent intellectual efforts on trying to justify and normalize Russia's aggressive behavior, that this is what's expected and therefore, nothing can be done. Now, if we step out from the mainstream and look at this kind of myth of Russia's imperial innocence, more from the leftist agenda, right? From critical scholarship, leftist agenda, the anti-colonial, decolonial studies from Latin America, from Asia, from Africa, right? The feminist agenda. The paradox there is that coming in from a completely different, set of assumptions, principles, and objectives, it still reaches a similar conclusion, because Russia is seen as a successor of the Soviet Union, and the Soviet Union is seen as the counterbalance to the United States and, the American imperialism all around the world during the Cold War and in the years after, right? And in order for them to take a critical take on, the practices, Russia's practices now in the 30, 35 years post-Soviet Union, but also during the Soviet Union, it would involve taking a critical look. Like when you open one issue, you open the full box, right? And it's a Pandora's box. And then, you cannot critique Russia without then ending up weakening your critique of the West. And they refuse to do that, because their agenda is too implicated and it would be otherwise too affected. And there is this paradoxical, I don't know to what extent it's present in the information space in Ukraine. And I know that UkraineWorld is running now this Global Partners series, which I think will do which will be a great and a huge contribution in showing, how this war resonates beyond the West, right? But Russia is actually perceived as an anti-imperial force in much of the world. If we look at many Latin American countries, African countries, Asian countries, and if you're interested, I can refer you to a bunch of colleagues of mine who are working on these things, and maybe you will want to invite them for a podcast, right? And how can it be that a clearly, obviously imperial force is perceived as an anti-imperial one, as perceived as an ally in countering, the Western imperialism? And it's basically, Russia did a brilliant job there to keep this legacy of the Soviet Union alive and to bend it to the point there where people, would not see what's right in front of their eyes, and would buy into this agenda, basically. And there are studies being done, on public support for Russia in different African countries, on state support, on how countries vote in the United Nations General Assembly, etc., etc., etc. And we kind of touch upon this in the article on Encountering Epistemic Imperialism, where we stretch the argument beyond, just West's planning and the mainstream IR, and say actually the critique and the commentary coming from the global South, the critique and the commentary coming from the feminist scholars and feminist movement is actually, perpetrating the same, is based on the same myth and is perpetrating the same epistemic imperialism, just for a completely different set of reasons. And basically what happens is the West yeah, in the West, they simply do not know much about Russian imperialism because Russia wouldn't tell them, and the rest of us were not asked or not listened to, right? Or not translated, or not published, or not given the fellowships to come and do research in fancy universities. Scholars in the West would usually study Russia to then study the whole former Soviet Union, right? They would not study local languages of all the other, former republics and currently independent states. So they would simply not know, or they would not wish to know, or they would think that they do not need to know, or they would think that they can get away without knowing, right? And I don't know if you can appreciate the difference between all of this, but I think, on a case by case basis, it would be, one or the other. So yeah, Eastern European studies for the longest time have been Russia studies, and Russia studies are not even Russia studies, but these are, Moscow and St. Petersburg studies of the urban Slavic core, ignoring the diversity and the multiplicity and the abuse and violence and subjugation and oppression, all within the Russian Federation. And they would also be focusing on history and literature and the high arts, rather than on the ground realities. So yeah, when it came to that, when there wasn't much expertise actually, and not much knowledge, so much so that many scholars were, scholars of Russia, or scholars of the region, and it's purely, my anecdotal observation of people I know. They would be going through an existential crisis. They would be deeply shocked and deeply shaken by this, because their object of study and object of love is suddenly behaving in the most cruel and for them unexpected ways, and it doesn't fit the frame that they've been holding. So yeah, there's a urgent need to look critically at Russian Federation, but also at the Soviet legacies, Russian Empire, and look at them closely, look at them critically, and look at them from the point of view of those that Russia subjugated. You cannot learn Russia without knowing how Russia's behavior been experienced by those who were the targets of this behavior.
Yeah, and first things first, very much appreciated this comparison between not knowing, not wishing to know, getting along with not knowing, and basically this points to the idea that this does not relieve from the responsibility because the somehow partial blindness or unwillingness to see this or that social phenomenon does not mean that we are not responsible for it. And another bright thing that I'll take away is you're mentioning that the work, the research that you done was collaborative, and basically, I guess it's very a vital thing to emphasize because empires, for the sake of their survival, have been frightened by the notion of nation, of individuality, and because nation is a political entity of free individuals who think critically and hence are not that comfortable for the regime is extremely important here. Ukraine's defensive war is about the people, all those who bring the victory closer on the front line and those who are helping in the rear, and Russia's war of aggression against Ukraine is also a war of fear before the individuality. And I think about all those civilians killed by Russia, which is also an attempt to kill the witnesses of this war and those who could pass the episteme of this war further. For example, Victoria Melina, who was a war crimes researcher and collected the stories of those who had survived war violence. And she was a person who tried, to highlight the episteme of Russia's regime. It's necro status that aims at destruction or devastation of all alive. And I also remember her poem, not identically, but it goes like air raid sirens across the country. It feels like everyone is brought out for execution, but only one person gets targeted, this time not you. All clear. So it goes like this, and it strikes the most because it's only one story among, the dozens of thousands that leads to understanding of the danger of pacifism, of pacifying the aggressor. And I know for sure that you have some thoughts on this matter too, on this oppressive pacifism that can be deadly. Can you please share with us?
Yeah, I want to share on oppressive pacifism, but I also want to go back to a few things you've just said because they inspired me to bring up a few things. Something that you were mentioning, on collaborative effort and how it is important. I was actually thinking, the mode of operation of all oppressors is divide and conquer, right? And as long as we're divided and each of us is fighting our own battle with our own resources, we are, of course, much weaker than should we, unite. And in that sense, I think collaborative effort by the societies across Eastern Europe, Central Asia, but also, scholars who working on these countries. I think there's huge potential and huge power in us coming together, in collaborations between us, in recognition that it's similar things that are being done in different variations, right, with different peculiarities, with different, contextual details, but fundamentally the same thing. And for us to realize that about each other, but also for us to come then together to make bigger arguments and to have more convincing power and more authority in countering the discussion in Western academia. And there is currently there is recently being created an academic association called Ruta, which is an alternative, academic alternative to the existing ones, academic association for the study of Central Eastern Europe, Central Asia, and indigenous peoples of Russia that would, work with this critical collaborative work in the spirit of solidarity. Something else I wanted to mention, and I think it might resonate with the audience members who are my age or older, my age being mid-30s. And I just found it as a great way to teach Russian imperialism and epistemic erasure. So when I have to teach it to students, I pop a slide with letter G, not the H, but the G. And there's like a funny cartoon I took from internet with letter G, and like there's a Gava and a Ganok, like a few images to it. And I'm saying, kids, this is a letter. And when I went to school to the first class in 1992, I was taught the alphabet, but I was not taught this letter. It didn't exist in the alphabet. And then when I was in the fourth grade, the teacher came by and said, kids, I've got news for you. There is one more letter in the alphabet, but don't worry. There is like 7 words that have it. Gava, Ganok, Gudzik, the usual package. So don't worry. You just need to learn these 7 words and you will write your final, dictation well, and you will go to the secondary school. And then when I was finishing the secondary school in 2003, it was like, okay, kids, don't worry. There is now 40 words with letter G. You need to just memorize them for your final exam, in Ukrainian language. And don't worry, you'll pass it and you'll go to university. And then I went to university and I studied in Kyiv Mohyla Academy. And for the first 2 years, we had, 4 hours of Ukrainian per week. And when we were ending, we got a list of, 600 words with letter G that we had to learn and memorize because they've been, in the meantime, discovered, rediscovered, reinstated, and, recovered. So I was just, and, I would use this anecdote and this, very personal example, but I find it so super telling, listen, it went down to erasure of letters. And, it took us 30 years or 20 years to reinstate those letters. And you can still not find them on a keyboard. If you just have a regular computer, try finding letter G, on the keyboard. It's usually not marked and hidden under one of the, digital signs. So I use this example, and I find that it has huge illustrative power, for students, because they cannot imagine that in their language a letter would be dropped from the alphabet, and that you would have to fight and work to recover it. And I'm like, I'm not even that old, I'm just like a person in the mid-30s, and I'm telling you, this is my schooling, so you can imagine how thorough the job was done and how recent this trauma is. And yeah, going back to oppressive pacifism, do you want me to go back to that, or did I get too far off track?
Sure. Sure. It's very interesting.
The idea of oppressive pacifism, I mean, how do we explain that? I mean, pacifism, everybody knows. Pacifism is, peace for all, peace above all, no war, no fight, no arms, no nuclear arms, right? Disarmament, against military budgets, against military aid, against NATO as a military alliance, right? And usually pacifism is very popular in the countries that are not at war or haven't been at war for a long time, or the ones that are waging wars elsewhere, right? Pacifism becomes oppressive when those who are pacifists are trying to impose it, force it on those who are at war, right? And that's what we see in the case of Russia's war against Ukraine, right? And the Western response from the Western left, from the Western feminists, from the Western pacifists, saying, stop war in Ukraine, do not arm Ukraine so that, because Ukraine will never win, so let's keep this war short and have Ukraine surrender. Ukraine should surrender, Ukraine should cede territories, Ukraine should stop resisting. Ukraine should, don't arm Ukraine, don't help it, fight longer, just let it lose sooner, right? And this is, of course, absolutely illogical, unethical, immoral, and in other ways bankrupt. Theoretically, actually, and empirically, right? Because theoretically, a right to self-defense is the core idea of feminism, right? Two core ideas: the support for the marginalized and the vulnerable, and the right to self-defense. So how is that lost, when we move to the advising to states, right? And it's completely ignoring the realities of oppression and violence that continues under the so-called peace, or occupation. And it's completely ignoring the calls coming in from Ukraine itself, right? Because there were multiple peace manifestos, peace for Ukraine, do not arm Ukraine, just let it surrender, without any, without a single Ukrainian signatory or even signatories from the region. There are multiple feminist manifestos without any Ukrainian feminists having signed them or having been consulted. And we speak about this in more detail in the article and in the forum. So if you're interested, just go read them and you will find the exact references, and you can find back these manifestos and read them and see for yourself how off-point, off-topic they are. And actually, you'd imagine that after 2.5 years of the full-out war, where Ukrainians have been vocally saying, we're going to resist till the last Ukrainian, and, women are going to join the arms, alongside men, right? And, absolutely. And when there is lots and lots of evidence from the miseries of life under occupation, right? And the genocidal nature of this war, you'd imagine that the conversation will have evolved, and that those who had these opinions at first have now educated themselves, informed themselves, and no longer hold them. However, there is new stuff coming out daily. And just yesterday, there was a big outrage on Twitter. It was started out by Ksenia Oksamytna, who is a great Ukrainian scholar based in the UK, working actually on peace and conflict studies. She shared an article recently published in the International Affairs called Ukraine and the Opportunity Costs of Military Aid. And the point of the article is to say, hey, we've spent billions of money on military aid to Ukraine to help Ukraine in its war against Russia. I'm quoting, that's the exact formulation, to support Ukraine in its war against Russia. However, we should have better used this money to fight climate change. And I'm just giving you the gist. I mean, I'm going to start laughing. I cannot even take this seriously to talk about this on a podcast. I just genuinely want to laugh, and I wouldn't even know where to begin to dispel this. I mean, this is, bankrupt on so many levels. It's just an abomination, right? But the idea, complete, replacement of terms and, misplacement of agency, who started the war, who's defending, who's fighting whom, why the money is going there, the effect of the war on climate change, actually. And just to, to put these two arguments in one package and say, actually, we should be fighting climate change instead. So we shouldn't be supporting Ukraine. So ethnic cleansing is okay, genocide is okay, war of aggression is okay. Let's just ignore all those and focus on a different agenda item, right? And this got published in a top journal just these days. So yeah, a lot of work to be done. Yes, we are more vocal now. Yes, we are more more numerous now. Yes, our arguments are now well articulated and are published also in top journals and go viral and have thousands and thousands of downloads and views and reads and get prizes. And, we are invited to sit on roundtables at the conferences. So, yes, there is some motion and commotion, but clearly, the conversation has not changed. And yeah, these arguments, they ignore entirely the local and the historical context, right? The fact that this is a war of aggression, that it's a genocidal war, that it's unfair, unjust, unprovoked, you name it. Whatever is your frame of reference, whether you're an international lawyer, a philosopher, a political theorist, right? Whatever your frame of terms is, it's that, the war fits. But also this, calls for pacifism, oppressive pacifism, or complete, diversion of attention and agenda and money. They ignore entirely the realities on the ground, right? That none of these proposals would simply ever work, right? If you look at it. And the lives of Ukrainians in this are entirely disposable. I don't know if you're familiar with the literature on, biopolitics, biopower, the use of lives, the managing of lives, necropolitics, who gets to decide, who gets to live and who has to die. In terminology of that literature, Ukrainian lives would be bare lives. It's just physical bodies that need not be counted and can be disposed of. So much so that some scholars are now articulating arguments of this being part of one bigger global war. So my colleague Vyosa Muslu, who was my co-editor on the special forum on the responsibility to remain silent, she has been articulating this in some public talks recently, right? That we in the West, in the Western academia, are looking at, there is the Russia's war against Ukraine, there's Israeli war on Palestine, there is a war in Somalia, there's a war in Sudan, there is a war here and there and everywhere, and we look at them as isolated conflicts. However, these are all part of one grand scheme and of one global war, and just because the people dying are worthless to the people in the West, and just because the people dying are not, American soldiers, French soldiers, German civilians, etc., that we don't even think about this as a global war. We don't even think about these as wars. We keep talking about them as conflicts and crises. And again, there is a great contribution in the forum by a Ukrainian scholar, Andriy Tyushka, who wrote on the title is In Ukraine Crisis We Trust, and he's looking at basically knowledge distortion since 2014, where scholars kept talking about civil war and Donbass conflict and things like that, completely downplaying or ignoring the fact that this was a full-out interstate war and that this was just the first step to a bigger one, right? So yeah, interesting times. The Chinese, may you live in interesting times. Unfortunately, we live in interesting times.
I guess we can put it in such way: contextualize, not pacify. And thank you for your work and for this conversation. I was joined by Olga Burlyuk, Assistant Professor of Europe's External Relations at the Department of Political Science at the University of Amsterdam. Thank you for listening and stay tuned.
This was a podcast Explain Ukraine by UkraineWorld, a multilingual website about Ukraine. This was a conversation between my colleague Daria Synhaievska, analyst and journalist at UkraineWorld, and Olga Burlyuk, assistant professor at the Department of Political Science at the University of Amsterdam. Let me remind you that you can support our work at patreon.com/UkraineWorld. You can also support our volunteer trips to the front lines at PayPal, ukraine.resisting@gmail.com. Stay with us and stand with Ukraine.